Seeing through the noise of hyped camera equipment on social media can be really difficult, especially when it comes to vintage lenses, which promise really magnificent out-of-focus backgrounds with really nice effects. But how much are they actually useful for recording most things you want to record for a business or social media? So today, we're going to look at 3 of them along with a control to see what's actually useful and what's just noise. We have the Super-Takumar 50-1.4, the Olympus f.Zuiko 50-1.8, the Sigma Art 50-1.4, and finally the Nikkor 28-75 2.8. This will be used as a control, so we'll stick it at 50 and we'll compare it to the other 3 to see what actually they offer over just your standard mid-range zoom lens. First up, we'll compare these lenses at 1.5 feet away from their subject. That was the lowest common denominator among these 4 lenses. The first thing you'll notice about the Super-Takumar against the other lenses is that it is noticeably yellowed. This is a common issue with these lenses, and it's very likely if you bought one used, you'll end up with a slightly yellowed lens. The one I have isn't too bad, I've seen worse on the internet, but as you can see, it does have a little hinge to it. This can be corrected in post, but all the images that I'm using have not been adjusted in any way. They're straight out of the camera. At wide open, we also see a bit of haze on the Super-Takumar, and it's not exactly as sharp as you'd want it to be. Stopping down, you see the Super-Takumar slowly get its contrast back, lose the vignetting, and get a very sharp image at f4. And you have a similar story with the Olympus lens as we stop down. It's decently sharp at 1.8, but you still see that haze around the eye. Jumping to the Sigma lens, it is very sharp. This sets it apart as a obviously modern lens, and it has decades of technological advancements behind it in order to give it that really nice sharpness, even wide open. It really displays just how sharp it actually is once it gets to f2.8, f4, and you just have so much detail on the subject. And at 2.8, the zoom lens is actually still very sharp for what it is. And at f4, the zoom lens still holds its own. Stepping back to about 3 feet away from the subject is when you see these vintage lenses start to shine, and you can see that good separation and distortion that you're typically looking for with these lenses. The Super-Takumar and the Olympus have the same story. As they stop down, they get sharper, the vignetting starts to disappear, but with that vignetting disappearing, you also have a little bit of that background disappearing. But typically, you only get that nice background distortion that you probably bought the vintage lens for when you're at that wide open and about 3 feet away from your subject position. Otherwise, it starts to lose a bit of its appeal, because if we look at the Sigma Art lens, it's very nice wide open, but comparing them stop down, which is when all the lenses would get a little bit sharper, the Sigma really shows how much sharper it is at this distance and just how versatile the lens is. Again, the zoom lens holds its own and it's very sharp, but it doesn't exactly have a lot of appeal even wide open. Stepping back one more time to about 4 feet away from the subject, you really start to lose that hard separation you get when you're so close to the subject, even when you're wide open. Looking at the Super-Takumar, you get okay separation, but you still have to deal with that softness and vignetting. Same thing goes with the Olympus lens. You just kind of start with that okay separation, and as you go down, you lose a lot of that hard separation at f4. With both lenses, you really lose what appeal you had originally with that nice blurry background. So again, you see the benefit of the modern Sigma and zoom lenses. They're producing a very nice clean image while really putting up a hard fight for these vintage lenses to defend themselves. Now moving on to a bokeh test, which is probably what you originally saw in these vintage lenses that influenced you to research them or even just buy one. They can create really nice distortion effects and super well separate the subject from the background and foreground. They can be very pretty, but how different are they from modern lenses when pushed to their minimum focus distance and shot wide open? Looking at the Super-Takumar, you really see where it shines. There is a lot of distortion. You get that swirliness around the bubbles. You also don't have any noticeable rings around the bubble, which can be distracting. Moving to the Olympus now, again, you don't have any obvious rings, which I find is a good thing, and you do see that swirling distortion, a little bit more so maybe than the Super-Takumar. But you do see obvious vignetting. If you look at those center lights compared to the outer ones, there's a large brightness difference. In real life, they are the same brightness. the vintage lenses, they still really hit their stride in this area. With that strong out of focus background, you see where their strengths lie. Jumping to the Sigma, you do see slight rings, so you can see what I'm talking about, where it kind of just sticks out and creates a look that doesn't quite have that smooth, distorted look. Although you do see a slight bit of swirling towards the edges, and vignetting is noticeable. Looking at the bokeh, the Sigma is just okay. It produces a good bit of distortion, but maybe not as strong as some may want. Looking at the zoom lens, the minimum focus distance is about 12 inches, so that's a bit closer than what the other lenses achieve, so it's able to really push that out of focus area and blur it very well. I think this is maybe the most trippy look of all, especially when you have objects moving in front of light sources like you see here. Despite it only being f2.8, it's still producing a very good out of focus background. And the zoom lens's bokeh is surprisingly strong, and especially in video it can produce some very trippy effects, though this may be too strong of a look and you may never even have your focus plane only 12 inches away from your camera. But personally, I think it looks pretty good, especially just for a zoom lens. Another reality you have to face when using these old lenses is that they often have some sort of distortion beyond just the pretty ones we like. They also could have chromatic aberrations, and with those vintage lenses, it really shows the weaknesses of these lenses. Now, you may want some chromatic aberration, you may like how that looks, but generally speaking, I tend to avoid it because I find it distracting. On the Super-Takumar, there is noticeable chromatic aberrations. You see that fringing of magenta and green, but as we stop down, it does get less noticeable each time, and it's mostly completely gone by f4. Very similar story with the Olympus lens. You see a lot of it at first, but as you step down to f4, it's mostly resolved itself. And the Sigma, once again, handles these aberrations very well. You see it at the beginning when it's wide open at 1.4. As you go down to f4, it's essentially completely gone and produces a very nice clean image. With the zoom lens, however, it's really not noticeable, even wide open. And before we get to the summary, there's one more aspect of these four lenses that I would like to compare, which is their focus fall off. It's a very specific thing, but it does have an effect to the overall look of an image. So if you look right here, that area where it is in focus to where it goes out of focus, and how rigid or smooth that actually appears. On the Super-Takumar, it's actually very smooth, and there's no obvious line from where it shifts from in to out of focus. And a very similar story with the Olympus lens. However, I don't think the art and zoom lenses actually handled this very well. You see with the Sigma art lens, there's a pretty obvious line from that shift from in to out of focus, and I think it's a little bit distracting, and we kind of see that again with a zoom lens. I think it's a little bit distracting and it subtracts from the overall image and doesn't help the lens in any way. Okay, now that we've seen what these four lenses can do in a vacuum, we can start to ideate what these lenses can actually do in a practical setting. And before I move forward, this is all subjective, and what I'm trying to highlight is what these lenses simply excel at, not necessarily what they can't do as a hard and fast rule. Any lens can really do any job, but I'll try to get at what they should be used for in most instances. Looking at the 1 foot example that we showed first, the art and zoom lenses really excel at that, primarily because they're just so sharp and you can't really see the background in those instances. So when you need to get up close to something and you don't really care about any distortion that's going on, these lenses will produce the most sharp effects. As we step back to 3 feet away from the subject, that's when those vintage lenses actually start to be very useful, and they can show their strengths with their distorted backgrounds and pretty sharp centers of the frame. The Sigma and zoom lenses are able to produce a very nice clean image at this distance as well. It's just not as maybe visually interesting as the vintage ones. So now that we've seen all 4 of these lenses, we can see where these vintage lenses' weakness starts to show. Their distorted backgrounds and pretty good sharpness definitely shine through and make them very useful in many situations. With these, you're not really going to achieve that signature distorted background look if you're shooting anything other than wide open. But if you're shooting at 1.4, 1.8, you're not going to have the sharpest image these lenses can produce. So if you want good all-around lenses, you typically have to make some kind of sacrifice. The Sigma Art produces very sharp images at wide open and still has a little bit of distortion. And it also has autofocus. Looking at the zoom lens, it's good all around. It's a very trustworthy lens, though it isn't that attractive with the backgrounds, and it generally produces a very standard, simple, clean image, which can be useful and is typically useful more than half the time. It just depends on the kind of look and the kind of work you want to get done. At the end of the day, I think all these lenses are very good in their own right and can be used for a variety of situations. I don't find myself using these vintage lenses more than a few times per year just to get a couple shots that I think they would excel at. These aren't the things that I use every day for work. But what do you guys think? Were you influenced by those vintage lenses off social media, and do you actually use them that often? But in any case, thanks for watching.